I appreciate Alan bringing so many of the themes in the songs and even in the children's message that have to do with prayer, since that's what we're focusing on in this segment of our sermon series. But Elijah's great story. I love the picture that he put up there. This series of pictures shows those biblical characters with darker skin, which they likely had. They were Jewish people living in the Middle East, right? I'm not sure Elijah was that buff, though. It says he did a lot of praying. I don't know if he did a lot of push-ups or not, but it does say that he outran the chariot that Ahab was in. So maybe he was like an Olympic athlete or something. I don't know. Never the image I had before, though. So one soldier in the British Airborne was going through his parachute training. And this included 8 jumps. 2 jumps would be from this balloon with a cage at the bottom that they would jump out at 800 feet. The other 6 would be out of an airplane. So there was this recruit, and he was about to take his first jump. And he overhears another one of the recruits asking the instructor this question: if my parachute doesn't open, how long will it take for me to hit the ground from 800 feet? It's a good question, right? The instructor nonchalantly says, "Oh, you'll be about halfway through the Lord's Prayer." Now, I'm sure that guy's going to be praying whether his chute opens or not, right? I certainly would be praying the whole way down, but about halfway through the Lord's Prayer. One day, a group of amateur climbers was scaling part of the Matterhorn in Switzerland. And they came to this very narrow, hazardous passageway, and suddenly a gust of wind came down from the mountain. And the guide, who was so experienced, knew immediately that something had to happen. And so he turned to the group, and he hollered to them, "Get down on your knees. You're only safe on your knees." And the whole group immediately dropped to their knees, which gave them a lower center of gravity as this wind, so it wouldn't take them off the mountain. But just think about that, right? As Christians, there's only one safe place for us, right? On our knees. Get on your knees. In other words, to experience true life, spiritual safety, we must always keep turning to God. And this is the main point that we want to explore today as we continue in this new series called Good Grief, expressing grief and finding grace. So last week, we talked about the reality of grief and that all of us are going to face suffering in our lives and how we need to learn to lament in order to move through grief in healthy and helpful ways. And as we learn how to navigate grief and loss and how to help other people to do the same, we always need to keep in mind things like patience and kindness and grace. These need to be practiced by everyone involved, including those who are seeking to give support and those who are receiving that support. Kindness and grace and patience. So Mark Vroegop begins the next chapter of his book, Dark Clouds, Deep Mercy, with this question: who taught you to cry? Think about that for a minute, right? Who taught you to cry? And the obvious answer is no one taught you how to cry, right? All of us remember the first sound that any of us made when we came into this world was this heartful protest, right? We all let out a cry. To cry is to be a human, and it comes naturally. But lament is different. The practice of lament, the kind that's biblical, the kind that's honest, the kind that's restorative, that's not natural for us. To lament is to pray. Lament is a statement of faith. Mark Vroegop says, "Lament is the honest cry of a hurting heart wrestling with the paradox of pain and the promise of God's goodness." Wrestling with that paradox of the pain that we're experiencing and the goodness of God. So actually, it is our belief in God's mercy, our belief in God's goodness, His sovereignty, that creates the need for lament. Without hope in God's goodness and promises, and the conviction that God is all-powerful, there'd be no reason to lament when suffering comes into our lives. Todd Billings, in his book, Rejoicing in Lament, says this. He says, "It is precisely out of trust that God is sovereign, that the psalmist repeatedly brings laments and petitions to the Lord. If the psalmist had already decided the verdict that God is indeed unfaithful, then they would not continue to offer their complaint." And so we Christians, we believe that this world is broken, but that God is all-powerful and that God is faithful. And therefore we lament. And our laments stand in that gap between the pain we're experiencing and the promises that God has given us. Mark Vroegop tells about a prayer summit he was leading for the staff in his church. And so he placed an empty chair in the middle of a circle of chairs. And while they were singing and praying and spontaneously reading Scripture, he invited people to come to the center chair and to share their prayer of lament to the Lord. Now, he'd been teaching them about lament and prayer, and he'd encouraged each of them to write their own on a card, their own lament. And then he offered them to put it into practice and to come share their lament. Mark knew there was a lot of pain in the room. And after an awkward moment of silence, a young woman came and moved to the middle chair, clutching the small card she'd written on, and she sighed. The emotions were obviously just under the surface, right? And her husband, who was on church staff, quickly joined her and knelt beside her. Others then followed. They all came out of their chairs and surrounded her, kind of gently placing their hands on her to show their support. And she, with a trembling voice, read her lament. "How long, O Lord? Will you forget me forever? How long will you withhold the blessing of a child from us? How long will we cry out to you? How many more days, months, or years will pass with our arms remaining empty? How much longer will we struggle to rejoice with those who rejoice while we sit weeping? But I have trusted in your steadfast love, and my heart shall rejoice in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord, because he has dealt bountifully with me. Thank you, Father." Now, if you remember Psalm 13 that we looked at last week, you'll see that her lament really just follows that outline, right? In one short prayer, she vocalized her deep sorrow while simultaneously reaffirming her trust in God. She sobbed, she lamented, and she trusted. Everyone returned to their chairs, and a moment later, a staff member came. He made his way to the center chair, and he lamented, "Here I am again, Lord. I don't like this chair, but I know I need to come. My wife and I long for another baby to adopt, and we're so tired of waiting and the emotional roller coaster, but we're trusting." And before that prayer summit was over, 4 couples had mourned empty cribs. And lament provided a language that anchored those grieving couples to what they knew to be true about God while they waited. So as I said last week, and I'll keep saying in this short series, all of us Christians, we're going to experience loss. We're going to experience some kind of suffering. And we need to learn to express our grief in a way that's helpful, that helps us find God's grace. So before we go too much further, let's take a minute and define what we mean by lament. Mark Vroegop says, lament can be defined as a loud cry, a howl, a passionate expression of grief. But Vroegop is quick to point out that lament is more than just sorrow, right? It's more than just crying. It's more than just talking about sadness, more than about just moving through the stages of grief. Lament is expressing pain in prayer in a way that leads to trust in God. And so throughout the Scriptures, we see lament gives voice to strong emotions that believers are feeling as they experience their grief and suffering. Lament typically asks two questions. And the first is, where are you, God? Where are you? When we go through the suffering, we wonder, is God distant? Has He left us? And the second question we often ask is, if you love me, why is this happening? Right? That calls upon those promises of God, of love and care. If you care about me, why am I going through this? Now, sometimes these questions are asked by an individual. Sometimes they're asked by groups or even nations. And we might be inclined to think that lament is the opposite of praise, and yet it isn't. Lament is a path to praise as we're led through our brokenness and our disappointments. We might think lament is a transition from pain to the promise, from heartbreak to the hope that God offers. So most biblical laments follow a pattern that has these four key elements in them. First is an address to God. It is a turning to God in prayer. And the second is the complaint. And the third is the request. And then finally, there's an expression of trust or praise. And Mark Vroegop, who wrote the book that I'm using as a resource, has narrowed it down to these four simple words. Easy to understand, right? And the first word is turn. Turn to God in prayer. And the second is complain. And the third is ask. And then the fourth is trust or praise. Each step of the lament is part of this pathway toward hope. In the address, our hearts are turned toward God in prayer. In the complaint, we clearly and bluntly lay out the reasons for our sorrow and suffering. The next logical step then is the request, right? To ask God to help, to ask God to act, to do something to help us with this suffering, right? And then finally, we express a renewed trust in God. We express our praise. And so we learn the biblical lament specifically from the Psalms. Psalms are and were the songbook of God's family, right? The Psalms contain the gamut of life's experiences, from the highest of joys to the deepest of sorrows, struggles and triumphs of life. Believe it or not, of the 150 Psalms in our Bibles, over a third of them are categorized as lament psalms. Think about that for a minute. Over 50 of the 150 are lament psalms. It makes up the largest section in that sense, or collection, or topic of the Psalms is lament. Why do you think it is that our contemporary songbooks contain so few songs that we might consider our lament songs compared to the songbook of the people of Israel? Why might that be the case? Could it be that our modern prosperity, our modern comforts, our love of triumphalism, or our misunderstandings of Christian suffering in the life of the church? Maybe these things have impacted the songs that we write, the songs that we like to sing. Now compare that with the themes or the tones of songs that we've traditionally called the Negro spirituals. Those songs were written by a group of people experiencing great suffering and injustice. And they cry out in their pain, and yet they're turning to God for help, right? Now, don't get me wrong, there's certainly a time and a place for praise and songs of joy and victory, and I'm that upbeat kind of guy. I like those kind of songs. Give me something peppy, right? And yet there is time for the minor key songs of lament. And certainly, laments are in the Bible for a reason. We need them, right? So with all this in mind, let's turn to Psalm 77. It's a good example of a song of lament, and especially one that focuses on this initial turning to God that's involved in our laments. So to learn how to benefit from lament, we must resolve to continue to talk with God, to keep turning to God in prayer. And I know that sounds pretty basic, right? I know you're probably thinking, well, that's a given. And yet, is it really? It's where we have to start, and yet it's sometimes something that we resist. So, as we've been learning, lament begins with an invitation to turn to God while in pain. Psalm 77 begins like this, verse 1. I cry aloud to God, and He will hear me. I sought the Lord in my day of trouble. My hands were continually lifted up all night long. I refused to be comforted. And so the opening words of this lament frame the tone. I cry aloud to God. The psalmist is in pain, and yet the psalmist is not silent. We note the psalmist isn't just talking with God, not just complaining to God, he's crying out to God. Other references to prayer can be seen in these first two verses, right? Verse 1 ends with the knowledge that God will hear the psalmist, right? And why do we pray to God? We know He is listening and that He'll hear us. In verse 2, the psalmist mentions that when he seeks God, and that is in the day of trouble. It's a time to seek God when we're suffering and facing difficulties and hardships. Also in verse 2, this seeking of God takes place all night long. So it's not just a quick prayer, right? Get it done and get on. No, this is an all-night suffering and pouring out to God. And hands being lifted up is a reference to the posture of prayer as he's talking with God. Clearly, the psalmist is reaching out to God in the midst of pain. And we must not overlook this point, and we must not take it for granted. This is not what everyone does in the midst of pain, right? Rather than turning to God, many people, when they face suffering, turn away from God. They refuse to talk with God. It takes faith to pray a lament. It takes faith to pray in pain. It's an act of faith to open our hearts to God, even if what we approach God with is just tough questions or a messy spiritual struggle. Prayerful lament, with its inherent messiness, is way better than silence. You hear me? Many people are afraid to approach God with the messiness of lament. They find that speaking honestly and openly with God is far too risky. I can't talk to God like that. Lightning may strike or something, right? But I submit to you, staying silent and not approaching God is far worse and more risky than approaching God in honest lament. Giving God the silent treatment is the ultimate manifestation of unbelief. To stew in silent despair is to reach a place of hopeless resignation. A place where we determine, why talk to God? He doesn't care. Why talk to God? He's not listening. Why talk to God? He won't do anything to help. Forget God. Obviously, people who get to that point stop praying, right? They give up. But silence can be a soul killer. Now, somebody might counter all that with, I don't want to be silent with God, but I don't know what to say. And I don't know how to say it. And this is the beauty of lament. It gives us what to say. And it shows us how to say it. Lament directs our emotions by prayerfully vocalizing our hurt and our questions and our doubts. But as good and as wonderful and as helpful as lament is, we must realize it isn't a quick fix. All right? Praying in the midst of pain isn't a guarantee that the emotional struggle will immediately be lifted. The psalmist's description of this ongoing tension in Psalm 77 is clear about that, right? Look again at verse 2. I sought the Lord in my day of trouble. My hands were continually lifted up all night long. I refused to be comforted. I think of God. I groan. I meditate. My spirit becomes weak. You have kept me from closing my eyes. I am troubled and cannot speak. See, the psalmist is praying, but it's not bringing immediate comfort or resolution. His prayer seems like they're not working. You ever been there? You felt like this just isn't working? This is an important lesson we have to hold on to. Lament doesn't always lead to a quick solution or a quick resolution. It doesn't always bring a quick or timely answer. But nevertheless, lament is the song we sing, believing that one day God will answer and give relief, and there will be resolution. So, lament gives us a way to pray through our struggle with a life that's far from ideal, far from perfect. Painful and difficult circumstances can surface big and troubling questions. The psalmist struggles with, why isn't God doing more? And you'll hear that a lot in the lament psalms. Where are you, God, and why aren't you doing something about this? Let's notice how the psalmist is thinking and reflecting on all this as the psalm continues with verse 5. Consider the days of old, years long past. At night I remember my music, and I meditate in my heart, and my spirit ponders. So David's thinking about these things. And this searching and reflecting results in 6 pointed rhetorical questions. Will the Lord reject forever and never again show favor? Has his faithful love ceased forever? Is his promise at an end for all generations? Has God forgotten to be gracious? Has he in anger withheld his compassion? Does the psalmist really believe these things? That God isn't loving? That God doesn't keep his promises? That God is unfaithful? I don't think he really believes those things. I think the rest of the psalm will show that. But we can learn something from this process. And what we learn is honest praying helps us recognize that the pain and suffering we're experiencing often cause difficult emotions and difficult questions that are not necessarily based on truth, and yet they feel like they're true, and they're troubling. Lord willing, we'll explore next week a little more about the complaint and what we can learn from that portion of the lament. But for now, the thing I'm hoping we learn today is that lament begins with humbly turning to God in pain. Anybody can cry, as we said at the beginning, right? It's human to cry, but it takes faith to turn to God, to cry out to him in lament. Lament is a prayer. It leads us through personal sorrow and difficult questions into the truths about God that anchors our souls. Look at where the psalmist goes next in verses 10 through 12. So I say, I am grieved that the right hand of the Most High is changed. I will remember the Lord's works. Yes, I will remember your ancient wonders. I will reflect on all that you've done and meditate on your actions. Now, this translation that we're reading from mostly is the Christian Standard Bible, which is the new one that I really like a lot, right? And that in verse 10 in the Christian Standard Bible says what we just read. I'm grieved that the right hand of the Most High has changed. Now, it's interesting. They have a footnote there, and you go down to the bottom of the page, and the footnote says this. Verse 10 is obscure and hard to translate. Now, I've given you the ESV at the bottom of this, and maybe you're reading from another translation. You say, boy, that's very different than what you read in verse 10 from the Christian Standard Version or Bible. Yeah, so the ESV says, then I said, I will appeal to this, to the years of the right hand of the Most High. And the ESV has a little footnote. And in that footnote, the footnote is an alternate reading of the verse, which is just what the Christian Standard Bible has. So there's some ambiguity there, right? Is the psalmist really saying, I'm grieved that you have changed, God? Maybe he is. Or is he saying more of the other, I will appeal to this, the years of the right hand of the Most High God. You know, either way, he's struggling, right? Struggling with, how do I reconcile God's actions of the past with God's actions in the present that I'm experiencing, right? He feels like God may have changed in some way, but he turns his focus back to the actions of God's past, what he knows to be true about how God has acted before. But then, even more important than focusing on the history of God's action, the psalmist in verse 13 shifts his focus to the very character of God. God, your way is holy. And what God is great like God? Now, how different is that rhetorical question than the other rhetorical questions we just saw in those earlier verses, right? Those other ones were questions of wondering, and this one is a statement. What God is great like our God? And this is an important turning point as lament moves us from honest questions into confident trust. This is the role that lament can play in our lives. And as I said earlier, lament's only possible when we believe that God truly is a good and holy God. Lament is how we learn to live between the opposing poles of the hard life we're experiencing and God's goodness. Psalm 77 ends with the psalmist anchoring his questions in the single greatest redemption event in the history of Israel, and that is the great Exodus from the land of Egypt. And the psalmist remembers this defining moment when God demonstrated his faithfulness and his love. Verse 15, the psalmist says, with power you redeemed your people. And then verse 16, the water saw you. The waters of the Red Sea, right? The water saw you, God. The water saw you and it trembled. And finally in verses 19 and 20, your way went through the sea and your path through the vast water, but your footprints were unseen. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. So for the people of Israel, the Exodus is the big thing to point to, right? Of what God has done and how faithful and powerful and good He is. For the Christian, the greatest moment of our redemption is what? What's our ultimate deliverance? It's the cross of Jesus Christ. The cross is where all our questions and all our heartaches and all our pain should be taken, to the cross of Christ. The cross demonstrates to us that God has already proved Himself to be for us and not against us. And the process of lament takes us through our pain and our questions and leads us right to the answers found in the cross of Christ. But in order for any of this to happen, we have to keep turning to God in prayer. Treating God with a silent treatment is not helpful. It will cripple us spiritually. Certainly our pain and our frustrations and our disappointments might tempt us to stop talking with God. But we must not let that happen. We must never stop talking with God. We must keep wrestling, even in its messiness, right? Keep struggling, keep praying. D.L. Moody said this. I thought this was really good. Some people think God does not like to be troubled with our constant coming and asking. He concludes, the only way to trouble God is to not come at all. You hear that? God's not troubled with our continuous coming, even if that coming is in its messiness and with our questions and our doubts. God's not troubled by that. What's God troubled with? When we don't turn to Him, when we stop coming to Him. And remember what someone once said, the quickest way to get back on your feet is on your knees. Let's keep turning to God. And remember, the safest place for us is on our knees. Amen?